The great hall of Bletsoe Castle was a world designed to remind the powerless of their place. In the winter of 1443, the air inside was colder than the wind that swept across the Bedfordshire fields. The stone walls sweated damp. The rushes on the floor gave off the faint, sweet, sour smell of trampled herbs, and the flicker of torchlight made the shadows dance like silent conspirators. At the far end, beneath the carved oak canopy, the Duke of Suffolk, William de la Pole, sat in a high-backed chair. His gaze was fixed not on the girl before him, but on the parchment in his hand, a contract more binding than any oath, more dangerous than any sword. The girl was Margaret Beaufort, just 12 years old. She wore her best wool gown, dyed deep green, with sleeves too long for her small frame. Her hair was neatly plaited, her face carefully scrubbed, but the thinness of her wrists and the tension in her jaw made her look younger still. She kept her eyes lowered, not out of shyness, but because she had been taught that a noble woman who stared too long was asking for trouble. This was not a family gathering. This was a transaction. Around her, the air buzzed with a low murmur of men who wielded the kind of power Margaret had been born into but would never truly own: knights, stewards, heralds, and one or two minor lords. Their talk was of dowries and alliances, of how Margaret's wardship, recently granted the Duke, could be turned into something mutually advantageous. The words were polite. The intent was predatory. The Duke spoke at last, his voice smooth as polished brass. "You will wed my son, John de la Pole, before the month is out." The decision was not a proposal, but a decree. Margaret's guardian had made his move. The Duke's eldest son was already promised elsewhere. John, barely 14, would do. Through this marriage, Suffolk would gain control over one of the most valuable heiresses in England, a girl whose bloodline carried claims to the throne and whose lands could bankroll a small army. Margaret felt the weight of the moment, without fully grasping its scope. She had been raised to know that marriage was inevitable, but she had imagined, perhaps foolishly, that it might happen when she was older, when she could at least understand a man she would call husband. Instead, the bargain was struck in a hall that smelled of damp stone and burning tallow, with men who never once asked what she wanted. The Duke leaned forward, the parchment curling in his fingers. "You will make a fine countess, my lady. Your duty is clear." Margaret curtsied, murmuring the words she had been taught. "As my lord commands." No one noticed that she gripped the folds of her gown, so tightly her knuckles blanched. From the gallery above, a musician plucked at a lute, the melancholy notes falling like cold rain. Margaret's eyes drifted upward, away from the parchment, and the Duke's sharp gaze toward the vaulted ceiling. In that brief, stolen glance, she tried to imagine a future where she was more than a pawn. But the great hall was not a place for dreaming. It was a place where girls became bargaining chips, where the Game of Thrones was played in whispers and sealed with wax. And for Margaret Beaufort, the first move had just been made. It was February when Margaret's first wedding took place, a month when the frost clung to the thatch, and the air in Bedfordshire was sharp enough to sting the lungs. The ceremony was held in the small stone chapel at Bletsoe Castle, its walls still bearing faint traces of painted saints from a century before. Candlelight pooled in the corners, struggling to push back the shadows. The air was thick with incense, though no amount of it could mask the damp smell of old stone. Margaret's gown was the finest she had ever worn, dyed a deep crimson, trimmed with fur at the cuffs and hem. Her head was covered with a modest veil, pinned so tightly she could feel it pulling at her scalp. At 12 years old, she barely reached the shoulder of her intended husband. John de la Pole was 14, a boy who carried himself as though trying to mimic the knights around him. His hair was neatly cropped, his tunic of dark blue edged with silver thread, but his face betrayed the awkwardness of youth. He glanced at Margaret with polite detachment, as if she were part of the ceremony rather than the reason for it. The Bishop of Winchester intoned the Latin vows, his voice echoing in the small space. The words were binding, though Margaret understood only fragments. She repeated the phrases when prompted, her voice soft but steady. When John's turn came, he spoke louder, though without conviction, like a boy reciting a lesson he barely cared about. Outside the chapel, the wind rattled the shutters. The exchange of rings was swift, the clasping of hands colder still. Then came the blessing, the final seal on a contract that had been drawn up long before the two had even met. When it was over, they walked side by side down the narrow aisle, their path lined with a handful of onlookers, retainers, servants, and the ever-watchful eyes of the Duke of Suffolk. Margaret kept her gaze low, the rhythm of her steps careful and measured. At the feast that followed, Margaret was placed at the Duke's right hand, her new husband at her left. Platters of roasted fowl, trenchers of bread, and goblets of watered wine were laid before them, though she found little appetite. The conversations around her about land disputes, military levies, and court gossip washed over her like the murmur of a distant sea. That night, there was no grand bridal chamber waiting for her. She was led instead to a small, firelit room where her maid unpinned her veil and brushed out her hair. The marriage, though legal, would not yet be consummated. Both were still too young. The maid murmured that in time, her duties would grow heavier, and she must be ready. Margaret lay awake long after the castle had gone quiet. She stared at the flicker of the dying hearth, the rough beams above her head, and wondered what her life would now become. She had left her mother's household to join the de la Pole family, but she did not yet feel she belonged to them, or to anyone. Her new title, Lady de la Pole, felt less like an honor and more like a weight settling on her narrow shoulders. Outside, the frost thickened on the ground, sealing in the prints of the day's footsteps. And inside, in that small firelit room, Margaret Beaufort began the silent, lifelong work of surviving the game she had just been forced to join. The seasons turned slowly at Bletsoe, but in Margaret's young life, changes often came without warning. Less than a year after her marriage, John de la Pole fell ill. It began as a fever, a flush to his cheeks, a heaviness in his movements, nothing that seemed extraordinary in a world where illness was as common as the morning frost. But within days, the sickness deepened. His eyes grew glassy, his breath shallow. The castle's physician prescribed broths and herbs, whispered prayers, and even bled him with a thin-bladed knife in the belief it would draw out the poison in his blood. Nothing worked. Margaret was summoned to his chamber once, when the Duke thought the sight of his young wife might rouse him. She sat quietly beside the bed, watching the boy who had been her husband for less than a year shiver beneath furs. John opened his eyes only briefly, offering a faint, unfocused smile before turning his face toward the wall. By the end of that week, he was gone. The news came to Margaret not from the Duke himself, but from a servant. Her voice hushed, as though speaking too loudly might call the spirit back. Margaret stood still, hands clasped before her, and nodded. She had learned already that in a noble household, grief was a private matter, one that could be taken as a sign of weakness if shown too openly. The Duke, when he spoke to her later that day, did so in the tone one might use to discuss the settlement of an account. Your marriage was not consummated. By law, your inheritance remains untouched. You will, of course, be wed again in due course. It was not sympathy, it was strategy. The truth was, Margaret and John had barely begun to know each other. Their conversations had been short, formal, and often in the presence of others. Yet his absence left a strange hollow in her days. Not the grief of losing great love, but the unsettling reminder of how fragile her place in the world truly was. As a widow at 13, she was now both a prize and a target. Her fortune and bloodline made her valuable. Her youth made her vulnerable. In the months that followed, Margaret's life took on a strange stillness. She was no longer bound to routines of a wife, but could not return to her mother's care. She dined at the Duke's table, sat quietly through the long winter evenings, and walked the frost-silvered gardens when the air was clear. In private, she began to watch more closely the way the Duke spoke to his advisors, the careful ordering of accounts, the subtle shifts in deference when higher-ranking visitors arrived. She was beginning, without knowing it, to study the language of power. One afternoon, she stood in the great hall where, less than a year before, her fate had been decided. Sunlight slanted to the narrow windows, falling in pale strips across the rushes. She imagined the scene replaying. The Duke at his chair, the parchment in his hand, her small figure before him. Only now she understood, truly understood, that such decisions had nothing to do with her wishes and everything to do with the ambitions of men. Her time as a widow would not last long. Word was already moving quietly through the corridors of Westminster and the cloisters of noble estates. Margaret Beaufort, sole heiress of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, was once again unclaimed. Somewhere, in halls she had never walked, plans were already being made. Margaret's second winter as a resident of Bletsoe passed in an unusual quiet. As a widow of 13, she had no husband's household to tend, no children to nurse, and no role in the political theater of a marriage alliance. At least, not yet. The Duke of Suffolk did not waste her time idly. Her tutors, once focused on courtly manners and piety, began to add subjects more suited to a landowner than a lady-in-waiting. She studied Latin to read charters and ecclesiastical decrees. She learned French, the language of diplomacy and law. She read from the Book of Hours each morning, but in the afternoons, she sat with Stewart over wax tablets, learning to calculate rents, tally harvest yields, and record debts owed to her estate. At first, she had approached these lessons as she had all others, with quiet diligence and the instinct to please her elders. But as the weeks turned into months, she began to see them differently. The tallies and lists were not just numbers. They were the bones of power. The yield of a single barley field could finance a soldier for a season. A well-placed grant to a neighboring lord could secure loyalty that no marriage vow could match. It was during one such lesson that she first heard the full scope of her inheritance spoken aloud. The steward, an aging man named Master Fenton, spread a parchment across the table and began listing her holdings: manors in the Midlands, rents from London properties, rights of fisheries and market tolls, and tracts of farmland that could feed hundreds. Margaret listened, hands folded neatly, as the list unrolled like a banner. She understood now why Suffolk had been so eager to bind her to his family, and why others would soon try to do the same. Her mother, Margaret Beaufort, visited once that spring, traveling with a small retinue. In the privacy of her chamber, away from the Duke's ears, her mother spoke plainly. "You must understand, my child, that your fortune is not yours to guard as you please. Refuse the wrong match, and they will strip it from you. Accept too quickly, and you may lose more than coin." Margaret nodded, though her throat felt tight. Her mother reached for her hand, squeezing in a way that was both comfort and warning. A woman alone in our world has only two defenses: her wits and the alliances she makes. Keep both sharp. That night, Margaret sat at her writing desk and copied a line from the Psalms into the margins of her prayer book. "Put not your trust in princes." By the summer of 1445, whispers had begun to stir. The king himself, Henry VI, had taken notice of her. A wardship was a royal gift, and the power to grant it could turn an heiress into a weapon. Margaret did not yet know the name of her next husband, but she could feel the current shifting. The stillness of her widowhood was ending. In the great hall one morning, Suffolk's clerk read aloud a royal writ sealed in green wax. Margaret stood at the edge of the gathering, her hands clasped before her, listening as the words rang out. "We, Henry, by the grace of God, King of England and of France, do grant wardship of our dear cousin Margaret Beaufort, sole heir John, late Duke of Somerset, unto our kinsman Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond." The hall murmured with approval. A royal connection was an enviable prize. But for Margaret, it was the sound of another door closing, another path chosen without her. The game was moving again, and this time the stakes would be higher than she could yet imagine. In the late summer of 1445, Margaret Beaufort's name was spoken not just in the halls of Bletsoe, but in Westminster, in Windsor, and in the private chambers of King Henry VI himself. Her destiny, which had seemed momentarily paused after John de la Pole's death, now became the subject of royal strategy. The wardship the king had granted to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, was no casual gift. It was a political move shaped by the intricate web of loyalties and rivalries that defined the fragile peace of the realm. The Tudors were a curious family in the English nobility. Edmund and his younger brother Jasper were the sons of Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier, and Catherine of Valois, the widowed queen of Henry V. Their half-brother was the reigning king. By elevating Edmund with the wardship and marriage of the wealthiest and most well-connected heiress in England, the king was not only securing his family's future, but also tying Margaret's vast resources to the Tudor cause. Margaret learned of the arrangement not through an intimate conversation or a gentle letter, but by way of a formal announcement read aloud in the Duke of Suffolk's hall. She stood still as the words washed over her. To be joined in lawful matrimony with our beloved kinsman, Edmund, Earl of Richmond, when the said Margaret shall attain her 12th year, as the law doth allow. Her 12th year had passed. The marriage could take place at any time. When she was summoned to meet Edmund for the first time, it was in the echoing presence chamber of Greenwich Palace. He was 24, tall, broad-shouldered, with a calm bearing of man used both command and calculation. His clothes were rich but not ostentatious. A doublet of dark velvet, a gold chain at his neck, the badge of the Beaufort portcullis at his breast, a signal his claim by marriage. Margaret curtsied deeply. When she looked up, his eyes were studying her not unkindly, but with the same assessing gaze she had seen in merchants weighing coin. Their conversation was brief, chaperoned, and formal. He spoke of her lands, the manors in Lincolnshire, the revenues from Kent, with a familiarity that made it clear he had already studied her accounts in detail. She replied politely, her voice steady despite the unease building in her chest. The wedding was set for the following year, when the political season would be most favorable. In the meantime, arrangements for her transfer from Suffolk's household to Edmund's began quietly. Margaret's wardrobe was inventoried, her servants reassigned, her dower lands listed and confirmed. At night, she lay awake in her chamber, the noise of the river wind rattling the shutters. She thought of her mother's warning, that a woman's defenses were her wits and her alliances, and wondered how sharp hers would have to be to survive this next turn in the game. In the shadows of court politics, her marriage was not simply a personal union. It was a calculated merger of bloodlines, one that carried potential to birth a claim to the English throne. That fact was not yet fully clear to her, but others already saw it. And in those private calculations, Margaret was less a bride than a seed from which a dynasty might grow. When the day finally came for her to leave Bletsoe, the carriage waiting in the courtyard bore the Tudor colors. The Duke of Suffolk, head of the strategist, offered her a farewell nod rather than an embrace. The road ahead would take her deeper into the royal sphere, and closer to a fate that would change England itself. The wedding of Margaret Beaufort and Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, took place in early 1455, a year when England's political tension simmered dangerously close to open conflict. The Wars of the Roses had not yet erupted in full, but the factions of Lancaster and York were already sharpening their claims, gathering their allies, and watching every marriage of consequence. The ceremony was held in the chapel at Llanstefan Castle in Wales, close to Tudor strongholds. The journey from Bletsoe had been long, passing through winter-bare landscapes and over rivers swollen with rain. Margaret traveled with a small retinue, her carriage lined with furs against the bitter cold. Every mile carried her farther from familiar halls of Bedfordshire and deeper into Tudor territory. The chapel was modest but dressed for the occasion. Banners bearing the red dragon of Cavalier hung beside the royal arms of England, a visible reminder of the Union's political weight. Torches flickered along the walls, casting light over the stone floor strewn with evergreen branches for scent and decoration. Edmund awaited her at the altar, his expression unreadable. He was a man of 24, marrying a bride of barely 12 and a half. To the Tudors, it was an advantageous match sanctioned by the king himself. To Margaret, it was the sealing of a contract that would shape her life in ways she could not yet measure. The vows were spoken in Latin, the priest's voice echoing in the vaulted chamber. Margaret repeated her lines with composure, her hands folded in Edmund's larger ones. Those watching might have seen only a dutiful young bride, but in her mind she was already weighing the reality of her new position. The marriage was to be consummated, though she was still more child than woman. This fact would shadow her life forever. Chroniclers would later note that Margaret's small frame was ill-suited to childbirth, a truth that would soon prove nearly fatal. But in that moment, the expectations of dynasty and alliance outweighed all considerations of health or consent. In the weeks that followed, Margaret settled into life under the Tudor banner. Llanstefan's high towers and thick walls looked out over the cold waters of Carmarthen Bay, a landscape both beautiful and remote. She learned the rhythms of a new household. The Welsh retainers loyal to Owen Tudor's legacy, the constant flow of messages from court and the quiet, deliberate way Edmund manages estates. Despite his political ambitions, Edmund treated her with a certain courtesy, though it was the courtesy of a man mindful of her value as an heiress, not the tenderness of a lover. She dined at his side, received guests, and sat through long discussions of rents, taxes, and the king's current needs. By late summer, Margaret was carrying Edmund's child. She was not yet 13. The news was met with satisfaction by the Tudors, and with wary calculation by others. In Margaret's womb now lay the potential future of the Tudor claim, a fact that made her both valuable and vulnerable. The court's eyes turned more sharply toward Wales, toward the young countess whose bloodline tied her to Beaufort's and, by extension, the royal house of Lancaster. But the safety of her pregnancy was not guaranteed. War clouds were gathering. The first battle of what would become the Wars of the Roses loomed on the horizon, and Edmund Tudor was preparing to ride into it. For Margaret, the journey from child to political figurehead had taken less than 3 years. And now, before her 13th birthday, she would face her most dangerous trial yet, one that could claim not only her child but her life. The autumn of 1455 brought a sharp wind to the western coast of Wales, carrying with it rumors of war from across the kingdom. The uneasy peace between Lancaster and York had shattered at St. Albans earlier that year, and though the fighting had quieted for a moment, the truce was brittle, more a pause than a settlement. Edmund Tudor's loyalty lay firmly with the Lancastrian cause, bound by blood to King Henry VI. In the great hall at Carmarthen Castle, where he had moved his household for the winter, the talk was of raising men, securing supplies, and riding east before the year's end. For Margaret, now heavy with child at just 12 years old, the plans were a shadow over every day. She could see in the way Edmund's gaze often drifted toward the maps laid out on the long table, his fingers tracing the routes to Hereford and beyond. One evening, as the fire burned low, he told her plainly, "I will not leave our king without aid, but I will see you safe before I ride." Safe, in Edmund's mind, meant placing her under the watch of trusted men, in a fortified keep. In practice, it meant Margaret would be left behind, far from her mother, far from the court, and entirely dependent on the Tudor network in Wales, a network that would become dangerously thin once Edmund and his men marched away. The rains came early that year, turning the roads to rivers of mud. Carmarthen's towers loomed against a slate-gray sky, the wind carrying the smell of wet stone and wood smoke. Inside, Margaret's world shrank to a few chambers: the solo where she sat at her embroidery frame, the chapel where she prayed for a safe delivery, and her bedchamber where the midwife fussed over her swelling belly. By November, Edmund had gone. His departure was swift, marked only by the clatter of hooves in the courtyard and the distant trumpet call as the column wound out through the castle gate. Margaret watched from a high window, her hands resting on the curve of her stomach, the child shifting within. She would not see him again. News traveled slowly in winter. Days passed with no word, then weeks. When messages finally arrived, they were grim. The Yorkist forces had gained ground. Skirmishes had flared. The king's position was weakening. And then, in early December, another rider came, this time with news that cut deeper. Edmund Tudor had been taken prisoner by Yorkist forces under William Herbert. He was confined in Carmarthen itself. But the castle's control had shifted to the enemy. Whether through neglect, illness, or the foul air of captivity, Edmund fell sick. On November 3rd, 1456, before Margaret could be brought to him, Edmund Tudor was dead. She was 13 years old, 8 months pregnant. Alone, the Tudors' enemies moved quickly to seize control of her person, for there came the unborn child whose blood could tie Lancaster and Beaufort together. But before they could act, Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, intervened. He rode hard from Pembroke to claim her as his ward, escorting her under guard to Pembroke Castle, a massive fortress on a rocky promontory, surrounded by the restless sea. It was there, in the deep cold of January, that Margaret went into labor. The birth was long and excruciating, her small frame straining under the agony. The midwives feared she would not survive, and indeed, it was said she never fully recovered from the injuries of that night. But she lived. And so did the child, a boy named Henry. Few could guess that this frail infant, born in a storm-lashed Welsh castle to a widowed girl barely in her teens, would one day wear the crown of England. The winter wind off the Pembrokeshire coast rattled the shutters of Pembroke Castle, carrying the sound of the tide hammering against the rocks far below. Inside, the great hall smelled of smoke, wet wool, and the faint metallic tang of seawater. Margaret Beaufort lay in her chamber, pale and gaunt, her body still recovering from the brutal labor that had nearly ended her life. Beside her, swaddled in layers of wool and linen, was Henry Tudor, her son, her only child, and the last living thread that tied the Beaufort line to the House of Lancaster. Margaret was 13 years old. The midwives urged her to rest, but she refused to be separated from the infant for more than an hour at a time. She would sit propped up on pillows, her thin hands cradling him, her gaze fixed on the tiny chest that rose and fell with each fragile breath. Jasper Tudor, now her guardian, moved through the castle with deliberate purpose. He understood what this child represented, not just to the Tudors, but to every Lancastrian loyalist in England. In Henry's veins ran the blood of Edward III, through his Beaufort ancestry. In an age when legitimacy could be argued into or out of existence by the right set of nobles, that bloodline was both a blessing and a curse. "Your son will be a target," Jasper told Margaret one evening, standing in the dim light of her chamber. "While York holds the court, we cannot bring him to London. He must be kept here, where the walls are thick and the sea is our moat." Margaret listened in silence, her arms tightening around the baby. She knew what he did not say aloud, that the Yorkists would see Henry not as an innocent child, but as a threat to be erased before he could grow into a claimant. The early months of motherhood were a strange mixture of fierce devotion and political calculation. Margaret learned quickly how to balance her roles: the gentle, attentive mother who sang quiet prayers over her child, and the shrewd ward of Pembroke who absorbed every word spoken about troop movements, supply shortages, and shifting allegiances. She also began to understand that she could no longer rely on others to safeguard her future or her son's. Jasper was loyal, but even he could be swept aside by the tides of war. If she was to keep Henry alive, she would need allies beyond Wales, men and women who could be counted on even if Lancaster fell. Letters began to leave Pembroke under her seal. Some went to the Beaufort kin who still held influence. Others, carefully worded, to those who straddled the line between York and Lancaster. She wrote with the humility of a young widow, but beneath the careful phrasing was a clear message. "I am the mother of the Earl of Richmond. Remember me when the tide turns." Henry was a quiet infant, rarely crying, his dark eyes following the flicker of torchlight along the stone walls. Margaret would sometimes catch herself staring at him with an intensity that startled her. In him, she saw not just her son, but the embodiment of every gamble the Tudors and Beauforts had made. In the summer of 1457, the castle erupted in alarm. A Yorkist fleet had been spotted off the coast, and for 2 days, the garrison prepared for the possibility of siege. Margaret refused to be moved from her chambers, keeping Henry close. If the enemy came, she would face them with her child in her arms. The threat passed, but the message was clear. Safety was an illusion. In the unstable world of 15th century England, every season could bring disaster. And so, in the flickering candlelight of Pembroke's chapel, Margaret knelt and made a vow, one she would carry to her last breath. Whatever it costs, whatever must be done, this boy will live to claim what is his. It was not the prayer of a meek girl. It was the oath of a strategist, a survivor, and, though the world did not yet know it, the architect of a dynasty. The years after Henry's birth unfolded like a chess match in which Margaret Beaufort was both an untested player and the most valuable piece on the board. She was still barely more than a child herself, but in the turbulent mid-15th century, the Wars of the Roses were stripping away the luxury of youth. At Pembroke Castle, Jasper Tudor acted as both a protector and her political tutor. In the great hall, he would let her sit quietly in a corner as he met with messengers, merchants, and envoys. She listened as they discussed grain shortages, recruitment of men-at-arms, and whispered rumors from London, the Yorkist consolidating power, the mental collapse of Henry VI, and the increasing influence of Richard, Duke of York. Jasper had no illusions. "We are holding a stronghold on the edge of the kingdom," he told her. "If York's grip tightens, Wales will not be spared. Every ally matters, Margaret, and every enemy must be kept at arm's length. even if they wear a smile. It was advice she took to heart. By 1458, the political map was shifting again. The king had recovered his wits enough to return to London, but his court was a nest of serpents. Queen Margaret of Anjou had grown fiercely protective of her son, Prince Edward, and saw any other Lancastrian heir, including young Henry Tudor, as a potential threat. Margaret Beaufort realized something chilling. She would have to guard Henry not only from Yorkists, but also from members of her own faction. When Jasper suggested she remarry to secure stronger protection, she did not hesitate. A husband's name could shield her lands and provide an extra layer of defense for Henry. The man chosen was Sir Henry Stafford, a younger son of the powerful Duke of Buckingham, and, critically, a man whose loyalties were not rigidly tied to Lancaster. The match took her from the remote coast of Wales to the rolling hills of Staffordshire. Pembroke became Jasper's responsibility. Her new household was quieter, more rural, yet closer to the center of England's political current. Even in Stafford halls, Margaret's mind was on the larger game. She cultivated ties with her mother's Beauchamp kin, renewed old friendships among the nobility, and, with careful courtesy, opened channels to certain Yorkist-leaning lords. She understood the danger of appearing too committed to one side when the balance of power shifted so unpredictably. Her letters during this period reveal a pattern. She never closed the door. To Lancaster, she was a loyal widow of Edmund Tudor. To Yorkists, she was a well-bred gentlewoman focused on her estates, harmless in politics. It was a mask, one she wore with increasing skill. In 1461, disaster struck. Edward, Duke of York, seized the throne, declaring himself Edward IV after the Lancastrian defeat at Towton, one of the bloodiest battles in English history. Jasper fled into exile, and with him went the last strong Lancastrian stronghold in Wales. Margaret's heart clenched at the thought of Henry, now a boy of 4, left vulnerable. But fortune, for once, intervened. Sir Henry Stafford's cautious loyalty to the new Yorkist king kept him in royal favor. Henry was placed under the guardianship of William Herbert, a Yorkist, a bitter arrangement, but one that kept him alive. Margaret swallowed her fury and played her part. She visited court when summoned, smiled when required, and listened far more than she spoke. Every glance, every whispered aside, she stored away for the day when she could use them. At night, in the privacy of her chamber, she would take out Henry's small wooden toy horse, one of the few gifts she had been allowed to send him, and run her fingers over the worn grain. She could not protect him in person, but she could build the web that would one day bring him home. The Wars of the Roses would rage on for decades, but already Margaret Beaufort understood the truth that so many men-at-arms did not. Crowns were not won solely on battlefields. They were won in the quiet corridors, in whispered promises, in alliances forged when no one was looking. She was 13 when she became a mother, 14 when she became a widow for the second time. By her late teens, she was a player in a game most women never even saw, and she intended to win it. By the 1470s, Margaret Beaufort had learned to walk a political tightrope with perfect balance. She had lived through the rise and fall of kings, the slaughter of Towton, and the shifting fortunes of the Wars of the Roses. Through it all, she had never lost sight of a single unwavering goal. Her son, Henry Tudor, would wear the crown of England. Henry had grown into a tall, quiet young man in exile. After years under Yorkist control, he had been spirited away to Brittany, far beyond the reach of Edward Ivy's court. There, he lived under the watchful eyes of the Duke of Brittany, safe from assassins, but equally safe from any rash attempt to return. Margaret could not see him, but her influence reached across the channel in the form of letters, gifts, and the constant whispering of his name into the right ears. She forged connections not only with exiled Lancastrians, but with disaffected Yorkists, knowing that a common enemy could unite even bitter rivals. The turning point came in 1483, when Edward IV died suddenly, leaving the throne to his young son, Edward V. But within weeks, the boy king and his brother were taken to the Tower of London by their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who soon crowned himself Richard III. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower shocked the realm, and Richard's legitimacy crumbled in the eyes of many. Margaret saw her moment, in a move of political genius. She brokered a secret alliance between her exiled son and Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV. If Henry married Elizabeth, the marriage would unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York, ending decades of bloodshed. It was a proposal so bold that even Richard III's allies could see its appeal. She worked tirelessly behind the scenes, coordinating with the Duke of Buckingham and other nobles to raise a rebellion in 1483. The uprising failed and Buckingham was executed, but Henry remained in Brittany, out of Richard's reach. Margaret was not spared suspicion. Richard placed her under house arrest, stripping her of much of her property. Yet even confined, she continued to plot. Servants loyal to her smuggled letters out in the false bottoms of trays, in the bindings of books, in the hems of gowns. In 1485, the moment came. Henry landed in Wales with a small force, marching under banner of the Red Dragon of Cadwallader. The decisive clash came at Bosworth Field. Richard III fought fiercely, leading a cavalry charge that nearly broke Henry's line. But at the critical moment, Sir William Stanley, Margaret's own stepbrother by marriage, turned his forces against Richard. The king was cut down, his crown retrieved from the battlefield and placed upon Henry's head. Henry Tudor was now Henry VII, King of England. Margaret Beaufort, standing in the crowd at his coronation, wore a gown of deep crimson silk and a small smile that betrayed none of the years of risk and calculation it had taken to reach this day. She was no ordinary queen mother. In fact, she refused the title of queen, preferring my lady the king's mother. It was a subtle assertion that her authority did not depend on marriage, but on her own standing. Under Henry's reign, she became one of the most powerful figures in England. She managed estates, advised on royal policy, and was a patron of learning and religion. She founded colleges at Oxford and Cambridge, leaving an intellectual legacy that outlived even the dynasty she had built. And through it all, she never forgot the road she had walked. Married at 12, a mother at 13, widowed twice before 20, a survivor of court intrigue and civil war. She had played the long game, and she had won. When she died in 1509, just 2 months after her son, she left behind a grandson who would become Henry VIII and a dynasty that would dominate England for more than a century. Margaret Beaufort had started life as a pawn. She ended it as the architect of a dynasty.